7.9, Arctic 5, was about geography. Some of these locations we have already talked about. Some of them might be new to this unit, but hopefully you know all of them. Paris, we mentioned in when the war really starts, that the Germans wanted to take over Paris. That was part of the Schlieffen Plan, because if you can capture your enemy's capital, it's like capture the flag, you have essentially won the war. Then with the Marne River, that's where the first major battle takes place on the Western Front, the Battle of Marne. The British and French forces extend along the river offensively rather than waiting to be attacked. They begin to attack the Germans to prevent them from getting to Paris, because the Marne River leads to Paris. Similar situation with Verdun. It's further down. It's 150 miles from Paris, but Verdun was a ringed, fortified city because they knew if the Germans took control of Verdun, they could sail up the Meuse River and take Paris. Then Constantinople, or perhaps you prefer to call it Istanbul. That is important. We haven't talked about that, but hopefully you remember that it is a city located on two continents. And it would be sort of that connecting point between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Now, this is important for us. Russia is on the Black Sea, and theoretically their naval ships could get out of the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. However, Constantinople belongs to the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans are allied with the Germans. So at this point is preventing the Russians from traveling freely. With the English Channel, we've talked many times before about how Britain's geographic isolation has protected them in many ways. That's true again here, but also Britain's very close to France. At its closest, 22 miles. So it does make it easy for supplies to get over from Britain to northeastern France and Belgium. The North Sea is a similar type of thing. It does provide a bit of a buffer between the German Navy and the British Navy. Whoever controls that territory could then control access to the Atlantic. And Australia, not on this map. Hopefully you know where Australia is down under. And Australia is important not necessarily geographically, but it's important for the people who live there, like South Africa, like Canada, like India. All these parts of the British Empire will be contributing soldiers to the war effort. So the first battle or campaign I want you to know about is the Dardanelles campaign. This takes place for about 8 months in 1915 and early 1916. Another way you might hear it referred to, it's sort of the more popular name, it's called the Battle of Gallipoli. So the purpose of this campaign, as you see on the map, the Dardanelles Straits lead to Constantinople/Istanbul. Now this is very important because of that Bosporus River. It connects the Black Sea and then through the Aegean to the Mediterranean. So this is seen by the Triple Entente, especially the Russians and British, to control this territory in order to allow freer transportation of goods, of military, of even just cargo to resupply the military. The British, at this point, the war has been going on a few years on the Western Front, but the British are counting on success in the Dardanelles campaign because they're going to use their navy. And as we have seen for the last 400 years, the British have had a superior navy, better than anyone else. They also, they know that the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, are sort of weak, and they've heard reports that they are particularly weak. So the British are prideful going into this. And hopefully, as you've seen this year, that when people are prideful, they usually fail. Here's a close-up of that map. So the first plan is to just use the navy to sail up the straits of the Dardanelles. So there you see, just to sail up and take Istanbul. Unfortunately, the British didn't consider a few important things. Biggest of which is the geography. Now, we're looking at a 2D map, but the straits are very steep. These are tall cliffs that look down onto the water below, which means that the Ottomans can shoot down on the British ships below. That's not a good thing. Also, the Ottomans had already preset mines in the water. So British boats are getting attacked, they're blowing up, they have to retreat. They have to go and find another plan. That second plan is created by Winston Churchill. And he says there should be an amphibious attack. So, like an amphibious animal, both water and land. An amphibious attack starts in the water, the Navy sails up, they land on a beach, and then take over the territory. So, in this case, it'll take place here. Rather than sailing up the Dardanelles as they had planned, it'll take a little bit more work, but they'll conquer the territory and then just easily walk over. One of the major groups that will be fighting in the Dardanelles campaigns are the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. This is where this British Empire really is important, having these resources, this human resources, able to fight this war. You see in this photograph, and this is now named Anzac Bay, after the men who fought there, you can see the terrain, you can see how rocky and steep it is. It's not unlike the coastline, right here in Ventura County and right along in Malibu. It's very steep, very rocky. Here's another great photograph of that. You can see from the landing craft on the water approaching the beach. Now, the Ottomans, they have this territorial advantage. They have the advantage of having the tactical position. They're up high, they can shoot down. The British didn't consider this. The Ottomans also, they understand the weather. It is very, very hot part of the year. And they were more prepared for this. The British were so caught up in their perceived future success that they didn't consider some of the problems. Here's an excerpt from a book that mentions the campaign in the Dardanelles. The Allied soldiers died in their hundreds, their blood turning the sea red. Of the first 200 soldiers to disembark, only 21 made it ashore. Any Allied survivors were forced to cling to narrow ledges on the cliffs and watch as their comrades died around them. The battle dragged on for months, despite the desperate loss of life and the fact that no headway had been made. The summer was blistering hot, causing the corpses littering the area to decompose even faster and cause even more disease. The winter was cold, sleety, and prone to storms that washed away the shallow graves and sent bloated corpses flooding into trenches. By mid-October, the Allies were having to face the fact that the campaign had failed. There had been calls for evacuation, but only after one last disastrous push. Back in August, the lack of progress had already been beginning to cause political problems for the commanding officers, but there was an insistence that reinforcements should be brought in. One of them was a man named David Campbell. Campbell was shot in the calf. As a fellow soldier helped him to dress the wound, that man was shot in the foot. David now helped in turn dress the man's wound, but gunshot was still raining down all around them, and up ahead they could see a wheat field full of the bodies of dead soldiers. Sure enough, David was hit again by a bullet that drilled through his foot. The orderlies on duty dressed his wounds, but there were no stretchers left, so David hopped between two other men until he had no energy left to do anything but crawl. Exhausted from the effort, he and his helpers finally made it to the field ambulance station, and David was placed on a stretcher and left overnight to try and get some sleep, between the shouts of the other wounded and dying men. In the morning, stretcher bearers began to transport those who had survived the evacuation point. They had to cross the beach to get there, and once again the snipers picked them off, until there were not enough stretcher bearers left alive to carry the wounded, who could only lie there, helpless, wondering whether each shot would be the final sound they heard. The sun burned down on them, and they had no water to drink. David came to the conclusion that the only way he would survive was by dragging himself to the evacuation point. And when he finally got there, he was treated immediately. There was no pressure on the medical staff because hardly any patients had made it to them alive. So because the British don't consider what advantages the Ottomans might have, this whole campaign is just a massive failure. It affects morale. There's a huge proportion of the Australian soldiers never come back. And this is different than fighting in the trenches in northeastern France. With the difference in terrain, it's a completely different type of fight. Whenever there's a failure, it's always nice to have someone to blame. So in this case, Winston Churchill takes the blame, because as Lord of the Admiralty, when he comes up with this amphibious attack plan, and it doesn't work out, he is the one to blame. Now, he wasn't one of the generals who was there telling the men to continue fighting, to continue going over the top, even when they knew the guns were right there. But Churchill is sort of forced to resign, and he's afraid that he will never have a career in politics again. If you're interested, there is the video clip from the last scene of the movie Gallipoli, which demonstrates you can sort of see the trenches, you can see the futility of the whole process. Another thing involving the Navy is the British want to prevent the Germans from controlling the North Sea, from getting out and controlling the Atlantic. So they create a blockade. We talked about blockades with Napoleon and the continental system. A line of ships preventing your opponent from getting through. Now, Germany's navy wasn't, inferior to the British. Building the navy specifically had been part of Kaiser Wilhelm's plan to prove that Germany was superior. He is interested especially in proving that his navy is superior because Britain is so used to relying on that identity of being the naval power. So the arms race is not just about guns, but it's also about how many ships Germany has, the quality, the size, the number of guns on those ships. The major battle that takes place in the North Sea is called the Battle of Jutland. Jutland is that part of territory that juts out into the North Sea where Denmark is. And it's midway between German territory and British territory. You see the purple arrows are the British, blue arrows are the Germans. They meet in the middle, they meet in the North Sea. And it's sort of a battle royale, except the result is a draw. It's a tie. Now, from Britain's perspective, this is good. It means that Germany does not control the North Sea, therefore does not control the Atlantic, does not have the opportunity to invade Britain. From the German perspective, it is a failure. Wilhelm wanted to be better than the British, not the same as. So in his mind, his perception of defeat means he isn't superior, even though he's just as good. So the blockade remains. Germany is not able to get its ships through the British blockade, so they create a new type of ship. They are adapting their technology into U-boats, and U stands for Untersee, meaning undersea. So the Unterseeboots, these are the first submarines. They weren't called submarines yet, they were just called U-boats at the time. So now the Germans don't have to worry about getting through the blockade, they can go under the blockade. And once they get out into open water, they engage in what is now called unrestricted submarine warfare. That means that unlike wars before, where only the military, only the army, only the navy is involved in fighting, the Germans start targeting civilian vessels, merchant vessels, people who are not engaged in war. And from their perspective, they say, well, we warned you. They publish in the newspaper, they post at ticket offices, hey, FYI, people of North America or Britain, whoever's interested in traveling across the North Atlantic, there is war going on. So if your boat happens to be flying the flag of our enemy, we're going to shoot you. Now this is very different. This has not really been seen before. The biggest example of this is the case of the Lusitania. This is one of these large passenger liners, not unlike the Titanic, coming from New York to Southampton, and it was attacked by a German U-boat. You can see the torpedo streaming in to hit it. So the Germans say, well, it was flying a British flag. Also, the Germans had intelligence that in the hold, in the cargo hold of this civilian passenger liner, there was materiel. There was resources, supplies having to do with war. And that's what materiel means, the stuff of war. Even though all the people on there were not in the army, they were not combatants, Germany considers this as an enemy vessel. So they fire their torpedo, a massive hole is blown into it, and it sinks in about 15 minutes. And 1,200 people die. So this is pretty extreme. Now, they did discover in the wreckage, they did discover that there were some guns, and the Germans say, hey, we were right to do this. This technically was an enemy ship. It is involved in the process of war, even though all the passengers were civilians. So to protect themselves, non-military vessels start traveling with military vessels in convoys, sort of like a big carpool if you have a bunch of people going on a road trip, or like a security guard. You travel with someone to protect you. Hopefully they won't have to, but just in case, they are there. The last big case of unrestricted submarine warfare is that of the Britannic. This is one of the sister ships to the Titanic, First, there's the Olympic, the Titanic, and last, the Britannic. Britannic was the largest of the three and the last to be built. They finished production in 1914, just as the war was beginning. So the Britannic never had the chance to be this glorious passenger liner, but is immediately requisitioned to be a hospital ship, and that's why it has the red cross on the side. So the Britannic is sent to the Mediterranean to function as a hospital ship. Yes, there are military people on board, but there's nurses and doctors and civilians, and not military people who are engaged in war. The Britannic hits a mine and sinks in 55 minutes, so a little bit slower, and about 1,000 people die. But still, it is inspiring the people. We must keep fighting. We cannot allow the Germans to engage in this improper style of warfare, and using this propaganda to convince people that you must carry on. We must win this war. We can't allow the Germans to win. Finally, in the air, we're going to start seeing the emergence of an air force, first with observation balloons. And this is essentially a hot air balloon on a tether. So you've got a big basket, and a guy goes up in the air, a couple guys with binoculars, and this is used for reconnaissance, getting information about the enemy, seeing, troop movements a few miles away, seeing if new trenches have been built. And then they can come back down, because hot air balloons cannot direct where they go. They are completely reliant on the wind. That's why Zeppelins become so popular. You see the picture of the Zeppelin there. It's an early type of blimp. It can be propelled. It can be steered. So in this case, the Navy will be using Zeppelins because they can go over water, they can go over the ocean and try and see where some of these U-boats are. They're not going terribly deep underwater, so sometimes the pilots in the Zeppelins were able to see where the U-boats were and then give that intelligence back to the Navy. Army is also using it, again, where the trench is being rebuilt, where are the troops, how can we use this to our advantage? There are a few cases, however, of Zeppelins being used for offensive purposes, dropping bombs, one in Paris and one over London. But really, when we think of Air Force, we think of planes. And this is the first war when planes are used, because it's really only been a decade since the Wright brothers had their historic first flight. The planes really do sort of replace the cavalry, the horses. Because if you think of cavalry in old-fashioned warfare, they would rush in. They would, kill some people, but they would get information and they would rush out. So now planes are taking that place, because as you'll see if you watch War Horse, the cavalry isn't very effective in terms of trench warfare. So again, it's about getting information, getting reconnaissance, and then eventually they will start using planes for offensive purposes. They will load machine guns. You can see here on this photograph, machine guns on these planes. At first, they experience a few difficulties, accidentally shooting off their propellers. So pretty quickly, they realize that they have to sync the pattern of the bullets with the rhythm of the propeller. As both sides start using this technology, we develop fighter pilots. Probably the most famous is the Red Baron from Germany. This is Baron Manfred von Richthofen. He was a young, noble German. He learned to fly these planes. He had more kills than any other pilot, shoots down more Allied planes than anyone else, and he becomes a bit of a celebrity. There's sort of this glamour to this new technology, this new warfare. And he eventually is killed in battle in 1918. So there you go. There's some of the naval and air developments from the First World War.